Back in 2012, I backed the Piecade on Kickstarter, and it eventually turned up. It was a DIY arcade machine. You put it together yourself, stick a Raspberry Pi in there, and then, of course, you've got to find the ROMs and things. And the software was the hardest part of this, really. Assembling it was quite a bit of fun, but getting the software to work just right was anything but. Now, I could have saved myself a lot of time and hassle if I just bought a pre-made arcade machine on eBay. There are quite a few multiple game cabinets available that'll just work straight out of the box. They've got great graphics on them. Quite a few of them are two-player as well, although, as you can see, the prices are way up there. And then there's a third option. If you've got a JAMMA-compatible arcade cabinet, you can buy one of these Pandora boxes. These have the menus and the software already pre-installed. It's just simply a matter of plugging it into your JAMMA-compatible device and you get access to hundreds of games. And then about a year ago, these things started appearing on the market. It's a two-player arcade stick with the Pandora Box functionality built in, so you've got access to the games with a menu system and a two-player stick, all for £120 and it just plugs straight into the television. That's a brilliant price. I paid more than that for an X-Arcade stick a couple of years ago, so I've got one. Let's have a look at it. Now, inside the box here, the first thing is a USB cable. We've got an HDMI cable, and down at the bottom here is a VGA cable, so you can plug this into an old CRT if you want the full arcade experience. There's the power brick, and we've got a UK-styled power plug. Of course, you get the appropriate one for your country with whichever one you bought. And we've got the instruction booklet here, which is in English, and it's pretty brief, but it just gets you going. Now, down the side, the plastic things here are the handles for the box. We don't need those, but we've also got some additional buttons. If we break the buttons on the machine, we can replace them with these. And below this piece here, that's the arcade stick, and it seems very well constructed. So looking at the back of this, we've got the USB ports, a configuration button, a volume control for the internal speaker, audio out, VGA out, HDMI out, and a power in, as well as an on-off switch. Now, I'm really impressed with the construction quality of this. It's got a good, solid, heavy metal base to it. It feels substantial. Once you've removed the protective plastic coating, you can see this thing is just the same as an arcade machine. We've got coin and start buttons for one or two players, 6 buttons for each, proper arcade joysticks and nice clicky buttons. It's just like an arcade machine, but without the cigarette burns. Now, if you connect it up using HDMI, the video and sound go through that connection. However, if you use VGA, you can send the sound off to something else using that 3.5mm mini jack, or use the built-in speaker that's inside the cabinet. One thing you won't find in the manual is a list of games, because there are quite a few different variations of these machines that are sold. Sometimes you'll find them listed in the seller's description on eBay, but whether you're getting the 600-odd game version or the 800-odd game version, you're getting a heck of a lot of games and a lot of names that you'll recognise. Now, I'm aware that the subject of ROMs is very divisive, and I'm not going to go into it at all in this video, but I will say if you don't want to play any of the included games, you can just plug this into a PC using the supplied USB lead, and it will show up as a standard two-player arcade stick. Okay, enough with the jibber jabber. Time to get this thing up and running, see what it does. So the power brick is multi-voltage, 100 to 240 volts, into which I'm going to plug in the lead that goes into the wall in the UK. If you happen to get the wrong one inside the box, it's just a simple matter of swapping that component out. They're easy enough to get hold of. Now, the HDMI lead is approximately 3 meters in length, which enables you to get the arcade stick a decent distance away from your TV screen, but I won't be doing that here. I'll be putting them next to each other so you can see it in action. Now, the output from this over HDMI is 800 by 600 at 60 Hertz. Now, I can imagine maybe some TVs would have an issue with that one. I haven't had any problems at all, but it's just something that I thought was worth mentioning. They do sell other models of this that output in 720p. Whenever you power up the device, you get to see this video playing, which I think is quite attractive. I much prefer seeing that than having text scrolling up the screen while the thing's booting in the way that my Raspberry Pi based mini arcade does. But once it's gone through that, it then loads the menu screens and you're straight into being able to choose what game you want to play. And you can do that by moving the joystick up and down to select the game you want, or tap it left and right to move through a page at a time. You can see the page numbers increase at the top of the screen there. When you find the game you want to play, just tap the top left button of the 6th, which will load it in. It plays a jingle which does get old pretty quickly, and then it's already set to free play, so no need to press the coin button, just press the start button to start playing. Now, if you were looking through those games lists before, you might have noticed that whilst there are a lot of different arcade companies represented, the games do tend to weight themselves a little bit towards Capcom, and in particular Neo Geo, which is fine by me because the Neo Geo games do seem to work very well. Now, whenever you want to move on to the next game, just press the coin button. It takes you into this menu where you can exit out of the game you're playing and move back into that menu again. Now, there is some order to these menus, even though it doesn't initially look like it. They're bundling together similar games, so all your fighting games are bunched together over a certain number of pages. Now, there are some pretty ropey games in here. I don't remember playing Jackie Chan in the arcade. I thought I'd give it a go, and it's pretty awful, so I'll never play that one again. It's fun to try these things for a couple of minutes, though, and if you do find something that you really like, you can add them into your favourites, so you don't have to scroll through all those pages of games just to get to them. And there are some games in here that are duplicated quite a bit. There's quite a few variations of Street Fighter 2, for example, and it's unlikely you'd play more than one of those. But even if you discount the dodgy games and the duplicated games, you've still got hundreds of different games in here that you can play without putting a single coin in a coin slot. Now, I'm old enough to remember playing many of these arcade games when they first came out. In fact, I go way back to the 1970s. That was the first time I saw a load of arcade games together, and there were no colour ones. They hadn't come out with any colour games at that point. Everything was in black and white. But there's one thing that's remained true from that day to this, and that's arcade games were designed to take money out of your pocket. And you're quite often reminded of that in these games where you'll get to a certain point and it's insert coins to continue and things like that, which of course takes away from it a little bit compared to playing a game on your console at home. Some of these games just don't really hold up nowadays, whereas other ones are pretty entertaining. This game is one of my favourites, and it's one that I've bought on virtual consoles in the past. I've got it on a few different devices, and I don't know, for some reason I just really love that arcade game. But it's one of those ones that as soon as you start getting a couple of powers, it'll say insert coins, and of course you press the coin button and it just carries on, which takes a little bit out of it because the pressure that was on you back in the days when you were in the arcade to try and keep your money going as long as possible isn't there anymore when you've got effectively infinite coins in your pocket. There's one type of arcade game genre that this machine is ideally suited for, and it's one-on-one fighting games. Of course, you've got 6 buttons per player, and it seems like they were designing this machine around that particular type of game, and there's a heck of a lot of varieties of those games in the list as well. I'm sure there are some experts in arcade games who are able to point out that this runs a little bit slow or something, but I haven't noticed any issues at all. It feels to me just like the arcade game did, and that's in no small measure down to the fact that the controls are very responsive and very accurate. Now, here's a bit of trivia for you. My name is Matt, and I spell it as M-A-T rather than the more traditional M-A-T-T. And the reason for that can be put down to arcade machines only accepting 3 letters in their high score tables. That's a habit that I started in the early 1980s and I've carried through to this day. Not that I ever really made it into any high score tables, but you could live in hope. Now, anyone who's ever played a game like Track and Field will know that these things are joystick killers. The buttons really do take a hammering. I had no fear of anything getting damaged on this one, though, because it's so well put together. This really is arcade quality. Of course, I've got those 2 spare buttons if anything does get damaged, but I don't think it ever will. It just feels like this thing is so robust, you'd really have to do something serious if you wanted to damage it. Now, with that being said, not all the games that are included in this device are suitable for playing on a digital joystick. Some would require an analog steering wheel or a trackball. Now, the reason that they'll have been included here is because it's just been ported across from that Jammer cartridge, which could have been put into a machine which would have a steering wheel or a trackball. But here we're just stuck with the joystick, and some of these games are a little bit too difficult to control using that method. Now, if you don't like fighting, shooting and beating up things, well, it's probably not the machine for you, but there are some puzzle games in here as well, some that you'll recognise and some that you won't. And I've even seen a few quiz games in there, although they were in foreign languages, which will make them a little bit difficult. In fact, there are a few games that you don't really want to play on this. For example, this one seems to be running a little bit slow. I say a little bit, quite a lot slow. I'm sure it's not supposed to be jerking around like that. You'll notice it in particular on the Sega games. These ones shouldn't really have been included in here because the hardware just isn't capable of keeping up with the game. They just run at such a slow frame rate, especially Outrun. It doesn't look too bad here, but the music is just running at a snail's pace in the background. It's supposed to be running perhaps twice as fast as this. And then on the flip side, you'll find the occasional game that runs a little bit too quickly to control. But you might be able to find an alternative that runs just fine. Now, if you press that configuration button, it takes you into this menu here, where you can change various universal settings for the system. You can also go into individual game settings, and apparently you can adjust things like game difficulties, as well as reorganising your games list and altering your favourites list. I must admit I haven't played around with any of these things. There's also a test for your joysticks and your buttons, so you can just check that everything's working as it should. Now, inside my joystick is a colour-changing LED light strip, which I don't think adds anything to the experience at all. You can't really see it when the lights are on, and it only really appears on certain parts of it. So if you see this offered as an optional extra, just ignore it. It's not something that you really need. And I should also mention that inside the case there is a fan to keep it cool, and you can hear it. It's not particularly annoying, but it is something that is quite noticeable. And talking of what's on the inside, let's have a look in here. I have to remove 3 screws from mine to get into it. It's got a hinged lid though, but there are some versions of this with 2 clips on the front. I think those are an earlier edition than the one I've got here. You can see the LED light strip along the bottom. On the top we've got all the various arcade controls which are wired into that small circuit board in the middle. Towards the front of that board you'll be able to make out a micro SD card that's held in place with a blob of glue. Now I anticipate that somebody will be asking me what's on the card, so I picked off the glue and took the card out and tried to read it in both Windows and Mac OS, but I found it was unreadable by both. So I put the card back in the machine because it's not something I'm personally all that interested in. Now there's one rather obvious feature of this 2-player arcade stick that I've yet to try, and that's 2-player mode, head-to-head games. Not something I can do on my own, so I've invited round my nephew, Harry, to see what he thinks of it. There you go, that's play 2, right? So who do you want to be? Bob. I'll be Homer then. Homer! Now when I was Harry's age, or perhaps a little bit older, a trip to the seaside, to me, meant a trip to the arcades. You get there and you find the biggest arcade you could, walk down the rows of machines trying to pick out the new latest models, play them, and then once you were done with that arcade, go next door and you'd find an entirely different set. You could spend an entire day just in the arcades. Now I asked Harry whether he'd ever played an arcade game at the seaside, and he said he hadn't, although he had seen some arcade games. It's just he'd only seen them on a cruise ship.
This beating you to death! You know what?
Oh, now let's see what other things. There's loads of things in here.
Can I do one like where you go through levels?
Do you want to try that one?
Yeah.
Now, whilst we didn't play all 800 and odd games, I picked a few out that I thought he'd enjoy, ones that seemed a little bit more like the kind of thing that he'd play on a console, and he did enjoy them, but only for a limited amount of time. He lost interest pretty quickly, and I think that's because of the way arcade games are designed. Of course, they're supposed to make you lose so that you put more money in pretty quickly, unlike a console game which has more of a progression. Your character develops, you'll often find things or explore. With arcade games it's quite often just punch kick and just carry on indefinitely. Yep, so there you go, what do you reckon?
It's just fighting games, more games, funny games.
Yeah, there's a lot of fighting games. Let's just go down at the end, there's some weird ones. There's puzzle games.
No, puzzle games are boring.
Okay, then there's Pac-Man.
Okay.
So given my extensive tests on one person for about an hour, I've got to say that this is the kind of thing that probably appeals more to an older person, someone my age who can remember these games when they first came out, rather than someone who's a lot younger that expects more of an in-depth console type experience. But that said, this thing works really well and it's incredible value for money. and I'll put some links in the video description which will point you in the right direction if you're thinking of buying one of these from eBay. But that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.